He had grown used to the feeling of eyes on him from the ridge, two small shapes at first, barely visible against the skyline, always vanishing when he turned. Years passed that way. But on one quiet evening, in the golden hush before dusk, they didn't vanish. They came down. The ridge was high enough that the morning sun hit it long before the light reached the clearing below. From his cabin porch, David could see the line where shadow ended and gold began, the pines glowing like they'd been dipped in fire while the ground around him still held the cool blue of dawn. Most mornings, the ridge was just part of the backdrop. He'd drink his coffee, check the woodpile, maybe scan the tree-line for deer moving toward the stream. But on that morning, something shifted. It was movement. Not the sway of branches or the slow drift of mist, but a flicker of shadow that didn't belong. He squinted into the sunlit line. The shapes were small, dark against the bright slope, and they were still. Two of them. He fetched the binoculars from the hook beside the door and steadied them against the porch post. The glass brought them into focus, two bear cubs standing side by side at the crest of the ridge. Their fur caught the light in patches, their ears sharp and still. One sat back on its haunches, the other leaning slightly forward. Both were staring down into the clearing. At him. David lowered the binoculars, blinked, then looked again. They hadn't moved. There was something unsettling about the stillness, not aggressive, not curious in the twitchy way of smaller animals, but deliberate. Watchful. He scanned the ridge around them for movement. No mother in sight. No shifting shadow that might hint at an adult bear nearby. Just the two of them, their tiny shapes stark against the sweep of grass and pine. They stayed there for several minutes, unmoving, before one finally turned away. The other lingered a moment longer, its head tilting slightly as if marking the cabin in its mind. Then it followed, disappearing over the crest and into the gold-lit trees beyond. For the rest of the day, David found himself glancing up at the ridge without meaning to. Each time, it was empty. But the image of them stayed in his mind, not because he'd never seen bear cubs before, but because of how they'd been. Quiet. Focused. As if they'd come there for a reason. That evening, just before the light faded, he stepped out to the porch again. The ridge was back in shadow now, the line of pines dark against the bruised blue of the sky. He scanned it once, ready to go back inside. They were there. Not in the same place, but farther to the left this time, partly hidden between two leaning pines. Even without the binoculars, he could make out their shapes, slightly blurred by distance, but still. Always still. He stayed outside longer than usual, sipping his coffee until the air chilled enough to bite his fingers. When he finally went inside, the shapes were still on the ridge. Over the next week, it became a pattern. Morning or evening, sometimes both, they would appear. Always watching from the ridge, never moving closer. They didn't seem to be passing through, and they never came from the same direction twice. One day they'd be near the pines, the next on the rocky outcrop above the southern slope. But always, they were there. David wondered if they were orphans. Cubs alone in the wild rarely survived long, a wolf pack, a hungry male bear, even a hard winter could end them. Yet these two seemed healthy, their coats thick, their movements measured. Not frantic. Part of him considered hiking up there to get a closer look, maybe see if there were signs of a den or a food source keeping them near. But something in his gut told him to leave it alone. They weren't asking for help. They were simply watching. And so, he let them. One morning, heavy fog blanketed the clearing. The ridge was hidden completely, the world reduced to a wall of gray that pressed against the porch. David stood there with his coffee, the cold damp soaking into his sweater. He couldn't see 10 yards in front of him, much less the ridge. But he felt it. The same quiet weight he'd felt each time their eyes had been on him. It was absurd, the fog was thick enough to choke the sightlines from both sides. Yet the sensation was there, threading into the stillness. When the fog burned off an hour later, the ridge came back into view. And there they were, two dark shapes at the very edge, just where the light met shadow. Watching. The ridge became part of his daily routine. Not in an intentional, check for them sort of way, at least not at first. It was more like the way you glance at the weather without thinking, or the way you listen for the hum of the stove when you know there's something simmering. Each morning, coffee in hand, his eyes would travel up to that high line where sunlight met shadow. And most days, they would be there. At first, he told himself they were just passing through. Young bears wandering together for safety. But the more he watched, the harder that theory was to believe. They weren't simply drifting across the ridge. They had places they preferred, outcroppings, stands of pine, boulders where the wind carried the scent from the clearing below. And they didn't appear at random. Sometimes they'd be gone for a day or two, and then, suddenly, both would be back in the exact same spot at the exact same time of day, like they were keeping to some internal schedule only they understood. The strangest thing was how still they stayed. Wild animals rarely waste energy unless they have to. A bear cub will usually dig, roll, swat at branches, even in quiet moments there's motion. But these two, they would stand or sit for long stretches, their eyes always angled down toward him. David found himself wondering what they saw from up there. To them, the clearing must have been a small, human-shaped interruption in an endless sweep of forest. A flicker of smoke from his chimney. A figure chopping wood, mending a fence, carrying a bucket from the spring. Maybe, from that distance, he was just another animal in their landscape. One rainy afternoon, he noticed something that unsettled him more than it should have. The rain had been steady all morning, the kind that soaks you through in minutes, but the cubs were still there. They were perched on the low ledge near the ridge's eastern end, dark against the gray curtain of weather. But instead of watching him, both had their heads turned toward the western tree line, ears forward, bodies tense. He followed their gaze, scanning the far edge of the clearing. At first, he saw nothing. Just the slow sway of wet pine branches and the shifting mist between the trunks. Then, movement. Low, fast, and gone before he could name it. Maybe a deer. Maybe something else. When he looked back to the ridge, the cubs were still fixed on that same spot. Whatever had moved, it had their full attention. That was when the idea began to take root. Maybe they weren't always watching him. Maybe they were watching the space around him. Weeks passed. The days lengthened, the snow on the ridge melted to narrow white streaks in the crevices. The cubs grew. They were taller now, their shoulders broader, their coats glossier in the warm light. From the cabin, he could see the shift in how they moved, less clumsy, more certain on their paws. They still appeared together, still mirrored each other's posture almost perfectly. One evening, just before dusk, David sat on the porch sharpening his hatchet when a faint breeze carried something unusual, a short, low huff. He froze. The sound had come from uphill. He scanned the ridge with the fading light catching in his eyes. There they were, not on their usual perch, but farther down the slope. Closer. They stood just inside the treeline now, their dark shapes half masked by the shadows. And this time, he didn't need binoculars to see their eyes. They were looking straight at him. The smaller one tilted its head just slightly. The motion was subtle, almost human in its deliberation. The larger one stayed perfectly still, but the weight of their presence from that stance was palpable. Then, without sound, they both turned and moved back up the slope until the trees swallowed them again. That night, he found himself lying awake long after the fire burned low, wondering why they'd come lower on the ridge. They'd kept their distance for so long. That step forward, even if only a few yards, meant something. He just didn't know what yet. The next morning, they were back at the top, as if nothing had changed. But David couldn't shake the feeling that it had. By midsummer, the ridge wasn't their only post. David didn't notice the shift at first, not until the rhythm of their appearances changed. There were mornings when the ridge was empty, and he assumed they'd moved on for the day. But then, hours later, he'd feel it, that steady weight of being watched, and glance toward the wrong place. Not the ridge this time. The tree line. It happened one morning when he was splitting wood in the clearing. The air was warm already, the scent of sap rising from the fresh logs. He bent to pick up a piece and caught the faintest motion in the shadow of the pines. He straightened slowly. There, maybe 40 yards away, stood the smaller bear, half hidden behind a thick trunk, his head visible just enough for their eyes to meet. David froze. It wasn't fear, more like surprise at the quiet certainty of the moment. The bear didn't flinch or step back. He just stayed there, still and dark against the tree. And when David finally turned to set the wood on the pile, the shadow was gone. After that, he started seeing them in other places, never close enough to feel trapped, but close enough that the distance between them had noticeably shrunk. Sometimes he'd spot the larger bear's shape slipping through the undergrowth near the stream, her fur catching the sunlight in fleeting flashes between the leaves. Other times, it was the smaller one perched on a rise above the garden, the light outlining the curve of his shoulders before he faded into the green. It was never random. If one was near, the other wasn't far. One afternoon, he was repairing the fence along the western edge of his property. The forest here was dense, the ground uneven with roots, the air cooler under the thick canopy. He'd been hammering for 20 minutes when he felt the prickling at the back of his neck. He set the hammer down slowly and turned. They were both there. Not on the ridge. Not at the edge of the clearing. Here, inside the shadowed line of trees, standing side by side. The larger bear was just a step ahead, her gaze sweeping past him toward the deeper woods. The smaller bear's eyes were fixed squarely on David. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the larger bear let out a short, deep sound, almost a breath, almost a signal, and they turned together, vanishing into the dense green as silently as they'd appeared. That night, David sat at the kitchen table with the lantern low, thinking about the changes. They weren't avoiding him anymore. They weren't just watching from a safe height. They were moving in close, using the cover of the forest to shorten the space between them. But for what? 2 days later, he got a partial answer. It was late evening, the sun long gone but the sky still holding a faint blue glow. He stepped outside to close up the shed and caught sight of something near the orchard, a large shadow, low to the ground, moving fast between the trees. Too smooth for a deer. Too large for a fox. His first thought was cougar. He scanned the area, heart quickening, but before he could confirm the shape, movement drew his eyes to the ridge. Both bears stood there, their bodies angled toward the orchard. Even from that distance, he could feel the tension in their stance. The shadow in the orchard disappeared into the trees. The bears stayed on the ridge for several more minutes, unmoving. Then they turned in unison and slipped back into the forest. David didn't see the shadow again that night. But when he woke the next morning and stepped out with his coffee, there were fresh tracks in the dirt between the orchard and the tree line. Not bear. Not deer. Feline. Large. The bears hadn't just been getting closer for no reason. They'd been moving in because something else was moving closer too. The day they left the ridge began with wind. It came in long, steady breaths out of the west, carrying sun-warmed pine and the faint metallic tang that sometimes rides ahead of weather. David spent the morning tightening roof straps and walking the fence line. The light was hard and clean, the sky so blue it looked brittle. By noon, the wind died, and with it came a hush that felt unfamiliar. No jays heckling the aspens. No woodpecker at the snag by the spring. Even the river seemed to draw its sound back. He paused by the porch rail with his mug and glanced at the ridge. Empty. Not unusual. But the quiet needled him. He set the mug down and walked the clearing's perimeter, scanning the tree line. The grass brushed his boots, dry and sweet, and the shade beneath the pines looked thicker than it should. Halfway along the western side the air changed. Not cooler, denser, the way a room feels a heartbeat before someone steps through the door. A black-tailed deer burst from the brush, cut across the clearing in a frantic arc, and vanished into the far trees without looking back. David stilled. The ridge remained empty. The quiet pressed closer. Movement flickered at the orchard, tawny where no tawny should be. Low to the ground, smooth as poured water, threading between fir trunks with that relentless confidence predators carry when nothing has told them no. Cougar. He didn't shout or run. He simply put himself between the orchard and the cabin. Bear spray and rifle were inside, distance and visibility would have to do. He stepped back until the field lay open on one side and the shed braced his shoulders. A sound rolled down from above. Not wind. Not branch. A deep, chest-borne note that hummed in his bones like a struck string. He turned toward the ridge. They were on the slope, halfway down, moving with the gravity of water finding its course. The larger bear led, head low, shoulders rolling. The smaller kept to her flank, slightly behind, eyes fixed on the dark seam of trees along the fence. They weren't drifting. They were coming with intent. The cougar paused at the tree line, one paw lifted as if the air had thickened. Its head rose, ears swiveling. Then it sank lower, choosing shadow. The bears did not run. That was what astonished him most. They kept descending, step after deliberate step, as if the mountain itself had decided on a different shape. They reached the last shelf of slope and stepped onto flat ground. For months, years, theirs had been a horizon-line story, silhouettes against sky. Seeing them level with his own breath, their size made real by grass around their legs and the sound of their pads on dry earth, unstrung something in him he hadn't known was wound so tight. The larger bear crossed the clearing at a diagonal, angling not for David, but for the place where shadow began under the pines. The smaller matched her, a half-length nearer the orchard. Together they formed a gate. The cat resisted. It slid left, seeking a seam. The larger bear pivoted, a slow quarter circle that required only weight and certainty. The smaller took one step and planted, chest square, head lowered, eyes lit with the focused steadiness David had come to know from far away. The cougar's tail lashed once. Twice. It tested the air, lips peeling just enough to show white. Then it crept backward 2 paces, body coiled like a spring that hadn't yet chosen direction. The larger bear rumbled so low David felt it more than heard it. The sound had meaning. It said, "Not here." What followed was simple. The cat tried the right, the smaller closed it. It slid left, the larger met it. No rush. No show. Pressure applied exactly where needed until the only path remaining was away. After a long breath the cougar chose it, turning with liquid grace, flowing back into the dark it had come from, a shadow accepting it was only shadow. Silence returned, fuller now, like a lung exhaling after a held note. The bears stood a moment in the rim of shade, listening to a calculus only they could do. Then, as if a decision passed between them, they turned, not toward the ridge, not toward deeper forest, but toward David. They didn't close the distance. 10 yards of grass lay between them and the clearing's edge, a line neither crossed. The larger watched the orchard once more and lifted her chin, almost imperceptibly. The smaller's gaze found David's and held it. There was no threat. No invitation. Only recognition, level and clear as day. He noticed then that his hands were empty. "All right," he said softly into the bright afternoon. "I see you." The larger bear turned first, moving along the curve of trees until slope gathered under her paws. The smaller held the look a beat longer, the same brief tilt of the head from long ago, then followed. They climbed without hurry, powerful without noise, until the ridge took them back and the line between day and shadow stitched itself shut. David stayed until the ordinary sounds returned, the jays mouthy again, the river unspooling its silver talk. Only then did he cross to the orchard fence and kneel where the cougar's prints pressed the earth. In the dust beside one perfect pad mark lay a small, smooth pebble, pale as bone, unlike any stone in the path. He turned it in his palm, its coolness shocking after the heat of his skin, and understood it wasn't chance that it waited there on the line between his ground and theirs. They had stepped down when it mattered. And they had left an answer he could carry. He set it on the porch rail for a while, letting light find it, then slipped it into his pocket. Ridge watched, but the distance felt changed now. After that day, the ridge didn't feel so far. David still saw them up there most mornings, their silhouettes sharp against the light, but the space between them now felt more like a path than a wall. They had stepped into the clearing once, and that changed everything. It meant they could again. The first week after, he noticed something subtle. They didn't just watch from the ridge anymore. Sometimes they would appear lower on the slope, closer to the tree line. Not always together, sometimes the smaller would be visible while the larger stayed hidden, or the other way around. But the watching was still there. It wasn't aimless. They were tracking. Not just him, but what moved in and around his land. 3 days after the cougar, David was hauling water from the spring when a rustle came from the ferns just beyond the fence. He froze, shifting the weight of the buckets to his thigh. The sound wasn't the light flick of a bird or the scatter of a squirrel. It was heavier, measured. A moment later, the smaller bear emerged from the shadows, head low but calm, nose working the air. His coat shone where the sun touched it, but his eyes were scanning beyond David, toward the ridge line. David kept still. They were maybe 30 yards apart, far closer than they'd ever been without a fence or slope between them. The bear didn't approach. He simply stood for a while, listening to something only he could hear, then stepped back into the trees and was gone. The encounters started adding up. A week later, while David was repairing the shed roof, he caught sight of the larger bear at the edge of the orchard. She wasn't feeding or passing through, she was watching the far slope, the same place the cougar had come from. Her posture was alert, almost protective. When she finally moved, she didn't go toward the ridge. She circled the orchard once before disappearing into the forest. It dawned on him that this wasn't coincidence. They weren't wandering into his clearing because they were curious. They were monitoring something, perhaps more than one something, and his land was part of that territory. One evening, David decided to test how close he could work with them nearby. He waited until the air was cool and the sun low, then set about cutting down a dead birch at the clearing's edge. He'd seen movement in the trees earlier, just a flicker of shadow that could have been them, and he wanted to know if his noise would draw them or push them away. The first few cuts of the saw rang loud in the quiet air. He kept his eyes on the tree, resisting the urge to scan the shadows. By the time he paused to roll his shoulders, the smaller bear was there, halfway between the ridge and the tree-line, standing still among the ferns. David's pulse climbed. The bear wasn't staring at him exactly, more at the work, the space it occupied. A minute passed, then two. The bear shifted weight once, then melted back into the trees without sound. When the birch finally fell, David stood over the trunk, sweat on his temples, and realized something strange. He didn't feel unsafe. Aware, yes. Focused. But not unsafe. The ridge visits continued, but more and more, he'd catch them from the corner of his eye at ground level. Once, while he was digging in the garden, a low breath from the tree-line made him look up. Both were there, just inside the shadow, watching. No sound, no approach. They simply stayed until he finished, then turned together and went back into the green. It was as if they were making sure he knew the clearing wasn't just his anymore. It was part of something larger. The answer came on a night thick with heat. It was the kind of summer evening when the air clings to your skin and the forest hums with life. David had left the windows open to let what little breeze there was move through the cabin. The moon wasn't up yet, and the clearing lay under a deep, heavy dark. He was reading by lantern when a sound pulled him up short. It wasn't loud, just a faint scuffing, almost like a foot dragging over dry grass. But it came from close. Too close. He reached for the rifle by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The dark was absolute at first. Then his eyes adjusted, teasing outlines from the black, the faint pale line of the fence, the shapes of the orchard trees, the glint of metal from the old wheelbarrow near the shed. The sound came again, closer now, moving toward the orchard. This time he caught it, not four-footed, not the fluid gait of an animal. 2 steps, a pause. 2 more. Human. Every sense sharpened. He kept still, rifle low but ready. The faint breeze shifted, carrying with it the acrid scent of sweat and something else, smoke, maybe, clinging to fabric. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be loud, but they weren't trained in silence either. A shadow emerged from behind the farthest apple tree. Taller than he expected, shoulders hunched, head low. The figure stopped, scanning the cabin, clearly deciding whether to come closer. That's when the sound rolled in from the tree-line, a low, rising growl that swelled into the kind of sound you feel in your ribcage before your ears fully register it. Then another, deeper, from the opposite side. 2 shapes detached themselves from the darkness under the pines. The bears. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. They came in slow, deliberate arcs, one on each side of the clearing, moving with a precision that seemed impossible for animals their size. The moon broke free of a cloud then, washing the grass in silver, and the figure froze. The larger bear angled toward the orchard, cutting off the path back to the slope. The smaller moved in tighter, her steps soundless on the grass. Together, they closed the space until the figure stood pinned between the two of them, less than 20 yards from David's porch. The person turned, as if to run, but the larger bear shifted just enough to block that route. No growls now. No sound at all. Just presence. David stepped forward into the lamplight spilling from the doorway. "You're on private land," he said, his voice steady but carrying. "Best turn around." The figure hesitated, head flicking between him and the bears. Finally, without a word, they backed toward the far fence line, keeping both animals in sight. Once their back hit the shadows, they turned and melted into the forest. The bears stayed for a few heartbeats more, watching the place where the figure had gone. Then the larger one huffed once, short and decisive, and they turned together, retreating toward the ridge. When the clearing was empty again, David exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. He lowered the rifle, leaning against the porch rail. It hit him then, this was why they'd been getting closer. Why they'd circled the orchard, stood in the shadows, tracked from ground level. It wasn't just about other predators. They'd been watching the space for more than animals. The next morning, the ridge was empty. No silhouettes against the sunrise. No dark shapes among the pines. It stayed that way for 3 days, and each day David found himself scanning more often, looking longer. On the 4th day, they returned, both at the ridge, standing in their old place. He raised a hand in an unthinking gesture. Neither moved, but he swore the smaller tilted her head again before they turned away. From that night on, he left an extra lantern burning on the porch. Not as a warning for intruders, but as a signal for the ones who'd stepped into the clearing when it mattered. The first time David set a sign for them, he didn't think of it as a gift. It was acknowledgement, a quiet nod that the clearing no longer belonged only to him. At dusk he walked the edge of grass where the ridge's shadow fell and placed a smooth river stone on an old stump, pale and veined. He'd carried it home years ago from a gravel bar where water braided into shining threads. He set it flat to catch moonlight if they came. He left nothing else. No food. No bait. Just the stone and the porch lantern burning low, its glass eye aimed at the tree lean. Then he went inside, banked the fire, and sat with the door open to night air that smelled of warm bark and distant water. He woke once to an odd hush. Not silence, silence had texture he knew, but a held breath at the threshold. He stayed in his chair, letting his eyes adjust. The flame lifted, then settled. Grass brushed. A single chuff, soft and contained, moved across the clearing like punctuation at the end of a sentence that didn't need speaking. In the morning, the stump was empty. In its place lay a different stone, darker, oval, speckled with mica-like star grains in a black sky. Beside it, 2 prints pressed the damp wood, one larger, one smaller, shallow ovals where pads had rested. He ran a thumb across the indentations and felt the faint grit left by a wet paw drying in the first heat of day. After that, the exchange became a rhythm. Not nightly. Not predictable. Sometimes weeks passed with nothing but tracks looping the fence and ridge silhouettes at dawn. Then he'd find a sign, a shed sliver of antler on the step, a strip of birch bark coiled like a scroll, a river-washed stick balanced on the gate latch. He answered with small, harmless things, an arrowhead from the old survey cut, a twist of copper wire polished bright, a brass button burnished smooth. He never set anything where food went. he never crossed the line by the trees. Everything he placed stayed within his ground, and everything they left waited just where shade began. Borders mattered, even in gratitude. Respect kept the peace, distance did the rest. Neighbors were rare, but in town the postmaster kept a scatter of rumor like birdseed. Someone's penned goats had spooked 2 nights running. A backpacker heard a weird low engine on a trail with no machines allowed. Tracks stitched and vanished with weather, stories did not. David folded the stories away. He knew the sound of that low engine. He'd felt it in his sternum when the ridge moved. The night he repaired the back fence under headlamp, moths scribbled frantic alphabets against the light. He worked quietly, hands numb from the chill that arrives first in the hollows. When he killed the lamp, black fell so complete he could hear wood settle. Across the field a single breathing answered his own, slow in, slow out, held. He lifted a hand without meaning to. The breathing stilled, then resumed, a reassurance offered and received. Small accommodations crept in. He stacked firewood with a wider lane along the orchard edge, a corridor between apple trees and shadow. He moved the compost farther from the fence. He kept the lantern trimmed so the flame didn't gutter. He learned the flame's steadiness steadied him, too. None of it was agreement or command, it was courtesy, the kind you extend when you understand you share a place. Habit turned ritual before he knew. Quietly. One afternoon, rain pinned him inside. He sat by the window writing notes in a small field book, weather, berries ripening on the south slope, the first bats 2 nights ago. Without thinking he added a line, ridge quiet, but watched. He stared at the words and left them. Watched did not mean owned. Watched meant kept. Near twilight the storm broke. The world smelled rinsed and sharp, pine needles shining, dark soil drinking light. He walked to the stump with a new offering, a napped flake of greenstone from the river's elbow. When he set it down, something shifted at the orchard. He turned and saw them step from the wet leaves like shadows with weight. They didn't come closer. The larger stood square to the slope, water beading along the ridge of her spine. The smaller angled slightly toward David, head tilted in the old, steady way. For a breath, they held. Then the larger exhaled a low huff, approval, command, he didn't know, and they withdrew into the rinsed dark. He returned to the cabin and lit the lantern early. The window reflected him and, faintly, the outside where night was building. Somewhere beyond that glass, they were arranging their watch, one on the high line, one ghosting the orchard. A slow circuit with a patience no human keeps for long. What surprised him wasn't comfort. It was responsibility. He felt held to a standard set by animals that had crossed a field when it mattered and then asked for nothing. The clearing seemed cleaner under that attention. He put tools away when he finished. He checked the gate twice. He listened for what the ridge said before choosing a path. On a cool morning with the first cedar edge of autumn, he found the mica stone on the porch rail where he'd left the greenstone hours before. Balanced across it, light as a signature, lay a single long black hair curved like a bow. He didn't know if it was gift or accident. He lifted it, felt how strong it was, and smiled despite himself. Noted, he said to the trees, and slid the hair into the field book where the page read watched. That night he slept with the door latched to the screen and dreamed of the ridge, not as a wall of trees and rock, but as a line that marks where you choose to look before you step. The first snow came early that year, not the hesitant dusting that melts by noon, but a slow, steady fall that began at dusk and kept its quiet pace through the night. By morning, the clearing was a smooth sheet, the grass buried under a clean white that held every sound close. The air was still, the kind of cold that makes breath hang like speech you haven't decided to give. David stood on the porch with coffee steaming against the bite of air. The ridge was a black cut against the pale sky, its pines carrying a weight of snow that hadn't yet slipped. No movement. No silhouettes. The old part of him that still expected their shapes felt the faint drop of disappointment. He dressed heavier, wool shirt, thick jacket, gloves, and set about shoveling the porch steps. The work was steady, simple, each scrape of the shovel marking his own passage across the morning. He moved to the path toward the shed, the snow whispering under his boots, when a sound reached him, the faint, rhythmic creak of weight on snow crust. He straightened and looked to the tree line. They were there. Not just one, both, stepping from the pines into the open, their fur dusted with powder, breath puffing in twin plumes. They didn't take the ridge line or skirt the shadows. They walked into the clearing as if the snow itself had erased old boundaries. The larger bear's pace was unhurried but direct, paws placing wide, deliberate prints in the white. The smaller kept close, head swiveling slightly as if noting each detail, the shed, the orchard fence, the shovel in David's hands. David stayed where he was, shovel blade resting in the snow. They closed half the clearing before stopping. He could hear the faint hiss of their breath, the shift of snow under their weight. The larger bear angled her head toward the ridge, then back to him, as if to say the lines between there and here had thinned with the season. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was a small drift slipping from a branch nearby, thudding softly into the powder. The smaller bear took 2 steps forward, closing the gap until David could see the frost crystals along the tips of his fur. Then he stopped, paw half buried in snow, and met David's eyes with the same calm steadiness he'd held from the ridge years ago. There was no tilt of the head this time. No test. Just presence, full and unguarded. David felt the urge to speak but didn't. Words seemed too heavy, too human for this kind of daylight. Instead, he set the shovel gently into the snow and, without breaking eye contact, reached into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled the mica-speckled stone, the one they'd left on the stump, and held it in his palm where the pale sun could find it. The smaller bear's gaze flicked once to the stone, then back to him. A sound came from behind, the faint but unmistakable call of a raven, and both bears turned their heads toward the forest. The moment broke without hurry. The larger bear took a slow step back, the smaller matching her. Then, without a sound beyond the faint crunch of snow, they turned and walked toward the far tree line, leaving 2 clean trails behind them. David waited until the forest swallowed them before moving. He crossed to where they'd stood and knelt, pressing his glove to one of the prints. It was perfect, each pad and claw mark sharp against the snow, the depth telling of weight and strength. When he stood again, the clearing felt changed. Not just watched, shared. That evening, he lit the porch lantern before the sun was fully gone. The snow outside reflected the light back toward the cabin, making the night less a wall and more a room. On the porch rail, he set the mica stone again, not as an offering this time, but as a marker, proof of a boundary crossed in daylight. He stepped back inside, closed the door against the cold, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the ridge wasn't just theirs or his. It was both. The storm that followed was a steady knitting that thickened the world into quiet. Snow fell for 2 days. David shoveled, rested, shoveled again. By the second evening, the path from porch to shed was a narrow trench with walls of white. On the third morning the clouds broke and light poured down clean. He stood on the porch and scanned the ridge. No silhouettes. The pines wore heavy loads, the river was a dark ribbon with white breath lifting off it. He stepped into the trench. He had a plan, walk to the orchard, then beyond, tracing where the bears had stepped from the trees the day they filled the clearing with daylight. The snow carried news, it would say where they had gone. At the orchard fence the drifts curled like dunes. In the lee of the last apple tree he found the first print, broad, sunk deep. Another, offset. 2 lanes, side by side, angling toward the northwest corner where fallen firs made a ragged ladder up the slope. He climbed carefully, planting each boot into their depressions when the spacing fit, cutting his own steps when it didn't. The slope yielded to a bench of open timber, and there the tracks tightened into a corridor between young spruce. The corridor became a trough, compacting the forest floor into a habit. That was when he realized he wasn't just following today. He was on a road. It bent around a basalt outcrop, then slid through a gap where old fire had licked trunks long ago, leaving char under bark. He touched the scar as he passed. The prints did not falter. They kept a bearing as precise as a needle, threading the bench, crossing a narrow draw, rising again toward a saddle he'd only seen from below. At the saddle the wind had scoured the snow to crust. The tracks grew faint, then vanished, then reappeared where drift filled. Beyond the saddle the forest changed, older trees spaced with a cathedral's patience, undergrowth subdued, light falling in clean plains. The path the bears used here was older than the storm, older than the season. Maybe older than his cabin. He paused where the trail widened beside a boulder the size of a truck. On its windward face lichen glowed winter green, on its lee, snow lay untouched. Set neatly in that hollow, as if sheltered for him, was a stone. Not river-washed this time. Slate, thin and long, with a white seam running its length. He brushed powder from it and lifted it. It was cold enough to sting through his glove. He turned it over, half expecting a mark. There was none. He set it back and looked up. The tracks continued, steady, certain. He followed. The trail dipped into a shallow bowl where the snow lay deeper. In the center, an old stump rose like a dark pedestal. Around it, the prince circled once, then went on. He stopped at the stump and saw, tucked into a crack in its top, something small and pale. A birch curl, coiled tight by freeze. He left it where it was. The bowl felt like a room someone had just stepped from. Beyond the bowl the corridor narrowed, then opened onto a ledge he had never reached. From here the world opened, the river bending toward a meadow, the far ridge stepping down in tiers, his cabin, a toy in a field of paper. On the ledge edge, 2 fresh prints stood side by side, toes to the drop, as if the bears had paused to see what he saw. He stood with them in that pause. A raven crossed between ridges on slow oar-strokes of wing, calling once. When he turned from the view, he noticed a faint path peeling away from the main trough, a seam of disturbed snow skirting the ledge's backside. Curiosity tugged, caution answered. He advanced 3 steps and stopped. The seam ended at a slab of ice where seep water had frozen to a plate. Beneath it, brown leaves and a scatter of small bones lay preserved like glass. Around the slab, no prints crossed. The path had approached and bowed away, leaving the trap untroubled. Wrong path, he thought, and felt the words land. He returned to the main track and carried on until the trees thickened again. The prince climbed one last low rise and dropped into a sheltered fold of ground cupped by firs. Here the snow was pocked with beds, oval hollows where warm bodies had melted nests into the white. 3, 4, he counted. The edges had begun to freeze. He didn't step into them. He stood at the margin and listened to the quiet they left. He could smell a faint musk lifted by sun. He could see the story in their spacing, one larger bed, one close, others offset. He let the moment be whole, then turned for home, placing his boots where he could into his earlier prints. On the ledge he picked up the slate and slipped it into his pocket. At the boulder he touched the lichen. At the bench he took the corridor slow home. When the orchard fence rose from the white again, he felt the relief of returning to a room after walking hallways you did not know you lived beside. On the porch he set the slate on the rail beside the mica stone. 2 lines, white through dark, parallel in winter light. Behind them the ridge held its breath. He wrote in the field book, old trail found, beds in the fold, wrong path iced, avoided. Then he added, shared roads. At night, the lantern threw its small sun onto snow that remembered every step. Somewhere up trail, prints settled and kept their shape. In the fold, breath rose from beds that would crust by morning. And on the ridge, maybe, 2 shapes stood where ledge met sky, looking down at a porch where a stone had been set to say, I saw the way you go. For us. The ridge was empty for 4 days. No silhouettes at first light. No movement among the pines. Even the night sounds felt thinned, the river's murmur carrying too far, the snow's hush too complete. David tried not to read meaning into it, but the absence grew heavier each day. He checked the old trail once, climbing to the saddle in morning frost. The beds in the fold were collapsed, edges softened by wind. No fresh prints. On the 5th day, he woke before dawn without the usual slow gathering of thought. His boots were on before the fire caught. Outside, the snow under his porch steps groaned in the deep cold. The sky was still a seam of dark along the ridge. He didn't take the orchard path. Instead, he cut straight toward the slope, following the faint memory of the trail he'd walked in Block 9's storm-clear air. The crust held his weight most of the time, breaking now and then with a muted crack. His breath hung in slow clouds, catching what little light seeped from the east. At the bench, the corridor of spruce seemed even older, their limbs heavy with rime. The trough was faint, softened by days of drift, but still there, a suggestion of movement, like a handprint left in ice. He followed it to the saddle. There, he stopped. Ahead, at the edge where the trail dipped toward the ledge, 2 figures stood. Broad-shouldered, heads high, steam rising from their breath. Not silhouettes against the sky this time, but shapes with weight and detail, the dark gloss of fur in the half-light, the frost rim along their backs, the rhythm of lungs working. They saw him. They didn't move. David stepped forward until the crust broke under his boot, announcing him. The smaller bear shifted weight, head turning slightly as if to read his pace. The larger stood square, gaze direct. Between them, the trough lay clear. He didn't close the full distance. Instead, he nodded once, the same small, slow acknowledgement he'd given from the porch months ago, then stepped aside, leaving the path open. The larger bear moved first, steady and sure, passing within 20 yards. The smaller followed, his eyes flicking to David's once, briefly, before the snow took his attention again. They didn't take the trail toward the ridge. They walked down with him. By the time they reached the orchard fence, the light had lifted enough to make shadows. The snow there was smooth until their prints marked it, 2 lanes bracketing his own. They skirted the apple trees, crossed the clearing without pause, and came to the porch. David stopped at the bottom step. The larger bear slowed, then angled to the left side where the snow banked against the wall. The smaller came closer, closer than he had ever come, until David could hear the faint crackle of frost melting along his fur in the sun's first touch. For a heartbeat, they held each other's gaze in the small space between living alone and sharing ground. Then the smaller bear lowered his head toward the porch rail. Resting across it, half buried in snow, lay the mica stone and the slate with its white seam. The bear's breath lifted small crystals from them. He huffed once, soft, then stepped back. David didn't move to take them. He let the moment stand. The larger bear gave a low sound, not warning, not dismissal, but something final. They turned together, crossed the clearing in a slow, even pace, and walked into the tree line where shadow took them. The snow behind them shone like glass in the cold light. He stayed on the porch until they were gone, the river's voice returning to fill the clearing. When he picked up the stones, they were cold enough to sting his palm. He set them back down exactly where they'd been. Later, in the field book, he wrote, "Beside the porch, morning, no ridge after." It felt like the end of a chapter, not of the watch. That night, the lantern's glow spilled over untouched snow. Somewhere, maybe high beyond the saddle or low near the river bend, 2 lanes of prints carried on through the dark. And in the cabin, on the rail, 2 stones lay side by side, holding the light in their own quiet way.